So have you heard of the song The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald by Gordon Lightfoot? Gordon Lightfoot was a Canadian folk singer once called the Pride of Canada, and he sadly passed away last year. If you didn't know, his most famous song, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, is based on a real Lake Superior shipwreck that happened in 1975, and it was a gigantic deal. I feel that since the film Titanic came out in the late 90s, the Titanic is kind of the only shipwreck people talk about nowadays. And I get it, gigantic blockbuster movie, hundreds of people died, the French woman with beautiful hands. Plus, there's sort of a romantic ideal about the high society that attended the Titanic and the fashion that they wore. But today I'm talking about the most interesting shipwreck to me, and that's the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And it's the most interesting to me because, well, I live in Michigan, I lived in the Upper Peninsula for 5 years, but the sinking of the ship is still a mystery to this day. To fully understand the shipwreck, I feel like we have to do some brief Lake Superior history here, so that you can appreciate the culture surrounding the Edmund Fitzgerald and understand why shipping was such a big deal on the Great Lakes in the 19th and 20th century. So the UP, or Upper Peninsula of Michigan, is up here. The media often forgets that there's this large plot of land north of the Mackinac Bridge. Eat my shorts, Sean Hannity! Now, if you've never been to the areas around Lake Superior, I bet you were wondering, why would anyone live up there? It's such a sparse population, there's very few jobs, and it gets hundreds of feet of snow every year. I'm not insulted because if you've never been up there, then you don't really know. It might be one of the most beautiful areas of the country. And for most Americans in the 19th and 20th century, it had abundant resources like iron and copper that were mined for lots of money. And when I say lots of money, I mean, quote, that this area produced more mineral wealth than the California gold rush, unquote. The Native American tribes that lived in the area knew about this well before the colonists arrived, and they'd mine copper by, quote, digging pits and using heavy stones to break waste rock away from copper masses to fashion bracelets, beads, tools, fish hooks, and other items for trade. The Ojibwe people also called Lake Superior Gitche Gumee, which meant big sea or huge water. Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake in the world if you measure by surface area, and it also contains 10% of the world's freshwater. When Michigan was trying to become a state in the 1830s, the only part of the Upper Peninsula that was populated by colonists was the eastern part of the Upper Peninsula. They didn't care much for the rest of the Upper Peninsula. They didn't know about the resources that it held, and their eyes were set on the Toledo Strip. They believed that the Toledo Strip was part of Michigan and not Ohio due to a mishap from a mapmaker. Ohio and Michigan had fought about this for years, and this all led to the Toledo War of 1835 to 1836. Apparently this war was mostly just drunk dudes fighting in bars with fists and sabers. There might be a random guy that would shoot above someone else's head, but the only bloodshed to come out of this war was when a man named Two Stickney stabbed a Michigan sheriff in the neck with a penknife. And, fun fact, Two's brother was named One Stickney. Imagine your parents hating you that much. President Andrew Jackson eventually came in and was kind of like, would you two stop all this fighting? And to appease Michigan, the U.S. government admitted Michigan as the 26th state of the Union on January 26, 1837. As a way to mediate the two sides, the U.S. government gave Toledo to Ohio, and they ended up giving the central and western parts of the UP to Michigan. That land would stop at the Menominee River, and the other side of that river was what would become Wisconsin. But Wisconsin wasn't a state yet, so they couldn't really say anything about it, just like they couldn't say anything about losing the NFC North last year. Toledo was seen as the much more valuable territory at the time as it was a port for Lake Erie, and people could transport goods around the Great Lakes from there. And colonists did not know about the resources in the Upper Peninsula until the mid-1840s, when they started to find copper and iron ore in the area, and then they started to set up mines. And conveniently, there was a gigantic lake here where people could ship these resources to the Great Lakes and beyond. This was vastly improved when the Soo Locks in Sault Ste. Marie were opened in 1855. These locks made it so ships had a fast and speedy connection to the Great Lakes that were south of them. By the 1860s, the Upper Peninsula apparently accounted for 90% of the country's copper, and by the 1890s, it was the largest supplier of iron to the country. And people found more copper and iron in the areas next to Lake Superior in Minnesota and Wisconsin. The land surrounding Lake Superior developed so much iron due to the, quote, leaching of silica by surface water or deeply circulating groundwater, unquote. You see, Lake Superior leached out natural iron-forming bacteria that accumulated in the land surrounding it. Tons of immigrants moved here to work on these mines, and a lot of them were Finnish, as I'd imagine Scandinavians didn't mind living in the cold, and the jobs were plentiful, so they felt right at home in their saunas. Saunas. The mining industry did take a sharp decline in the 1920s, but there were still a few mines yielding these precious resources. So by the 1950s, there was still a need for large ships to transport goods around the Great Lakes. Enter the main character of our story, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. The Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company was a large investor in the mineral and iron industry. And so in 1957, they became the first American life insurance company to invest in building a ship by ordering the construction of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Why name it that? Well, the president of the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company was named Edmund Fitzgerald. And he actually didn't want the ship named after him. I don't know why, maybe he was a shy little guy. But the board voted to name the ship after him when he stepped out during a meeting. So Northwestern Mutual then contracted Great Lakes Engineering Works in River Rouge/Ecorse, Michigan to build the Fitz. You see, the St. Lawrence Seaway was being built, and this would connect the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, and it would make it possible for ocean-sized vessels to traverse the Great Lakes. And so Great Lakes Engineering Works began work and finished building the Fitz all within 1 year, and it was launched out of the River Rouge yard on June 7, 1958. They built her to be 729 feet, which was 1 foot short of the maximum that a ship could be built and still fit in the Soo Locks and the St. Lawrence Seaway. And this was also the longest ship to be built on the Great Lakes up to that point, and so those that knew her called her the Queen of the Great Lakes. It also garnered other nicknames such as the Pride of the American Side and the Fitz. And so what does one do when you launch a boat of this magnitude? You, of course, have a party, and you christen the ship. And ironically, the christening and launch of the ship was also wrought with bad luck. You see, the wife of Edmund Fitzgerald, a woman by the name of Elizabeth Fitzgerald, was in charge of christening the ship. And what does that entail? That entails breaking a champagne bottle over the bow of the ship. Why is this a thing? Well, sailors, mariners, and people that work on ships are extremely superstitious people. They know that when you go into sea, weather can change erratically, or a gigantic sea monster could eat you. And the christening of the ship is apparently a tradition that goes all the way back to the Romans. Back in the day, you'd usually just pour any sort of liquid on the ship as an offering to the gods to protect your ship. Eventually, it was Americans that started using champagne for the christening of the ship, as it seemed a bit classier and like you were sacrificing something a little more of note. And as Americans do, we turned this into completely obliterating a champagne bottle because we enjoy destruction. Anyway, going back to Elizabeth Fitzgerald and the christening and launch of the Edmund Fitzgerald, 15,000 people showed up to see this ship get launched, as many people saw it as the pride of the Great Lakes region for its size and the jobs that it would bring. But as Elizabeth Fitzgerald tried to break a champagne bottle over the bow of the ship, it took her 3 times to do this. She couldn't do it the first 2 times, and if you ask any ship worker or mariner, this is very bad luck. And when it finally launched, it launched sideways and released a gigantic wave that doused all the ongoing spectators. A few people describe this as seeing a ship, quote, trying to climb right out of water. And when this gigantic wave hit the crowd, it actually caused one of the men in the audience to have a heart attack and die. The Fitz eventually righted herself, and that was that. But if you're a believer in maritime superstitions, you could say that the Queen of the Great Lakes was doomed from the start. Regardless, after 9 days of sea trials, the Edmund Fitzgerald was launched for duty on September 22, 1958. Now, what was the Edmund Fitzgerald actually used for? Well, Northwestern Mutual wasn't in the business of operating ships, so they loaned it to an ore mining company called Ogilvy Norton. The Fitz largely hauled taconite pellets from iron ore mines around Duluth, Minnesota, and Superior, Wisconsin, which were to be shipped in ironworks in Detroit, Toledo, and sometimes other places around the Great Lakes. Basically, at the end of World War II, a lot of the higher-grade iron in the areas around Lake Superior was already mined. And taconite was a type of banded iron that was interlaid with other minerals. Taconite is usually melted down to be made into steel, which is then used for products made out of steel or containing steel. Because of the Edmund Fitzgerald's size, she would often haul over 20,000 tons of taconite pellets. And before her sinking, she had set the season hauling record 6 times, including in 1972 when she hauled a little more than 30,000 tons of taconite, which is equal to 60 million pounds or 230,769 gold dusts. The Edmund Fitzgerald could reach a top speed of 14.2 knots or 16.3 miles per hour. And some even called it the Toledo Express because it could make a round trip from Superior, Wisconsin to Toledo in 5 days. It was also known as a higher class type of freighter because of the amenities on board and how the crew treated their guests, which were mostly insurance executives who enjoyed partying at sea. One guest by the name of Frederick Stonehouse even wrote, quote, "Stewards treated the guests to the entire VIP routine. The cuisine was reportedly excellent and snacks were always available in the lounge. A small but well-stocked kitchenette provided the drinks once each trip, The captain held a candlelight dinner for the guests, complete with mess-jacketed stewards and special clam digger punch. I was curious to see what a clam digger's punch was, and it's apparently a Bloody Mary type of drink that a lot of seaside folk and ship workers enjoy. To make this drink, you combine clamato juice, vodka, Worcestershire sauce, celery seed, hot sauce, lemon, dried dill, and ground black pepper, served over ice with a garnish of little-necked shucked clams. Furthermore, between 1966 and 1971, the Fitz had a celebrity captain by the name of Captain Peter Pulser. He'd also blow the ship's bullhorn when he had crowds near the Sioux Locks or near the Detroit River, and he'd shout random facts about the Queen of the Great Lakes. The following year, after Captain Peter Pulser retired, a man by the name of Ernest M. McSorley took over as the captain of the Fitz in 1972. And McSorley would be the last captain that the Queen of the Lakes ever knew. Ernest McSorley had been a mariner for over 40 years and was known for his perseverance through rough and treacherous storms. After a few years of captaining the Fitz, in 1975, he decided that he would retire at the end of the shipping season that year. And November 9th, 1975, would have been the launch of his last voyage, and his first mate was also retiring after this voyage. But sadly, Gitche Gumee had different plans for them. On the morning before the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the crew loaded up the Fitz with taconite pellets from Burlington Northern Dock 1 from Superior, Wisconsin, and she was scheduled to transport these pellets to Zug Island on the Detroit River. The Fitz left Burlington Northern Railroad Dock 1 at 2:20 p.m. on November 9th, 1975, and it was carrying 26,116 tons of taconite pellets. Now, these pellets would have been in the cargo holds of the ship, as you see here, and those cargo holds were clamped down by hatch clamps. It's not unusual for ships to leave dock without all their hatch clamps tightened, as there's hundreds of these things and it takes a long time to tighten all of them. And you'd actually have to manually clamp these down one by one, so sometimes they'd leave dock and clamp these down at sea. And it was reported that the Fitz did indeed leave the dock without all their hatch clamps secured and tightened. More on that later. Only 19 minutes after the Fitz had departed from Superior, Wisconsin, the National Weather Service had issued gale warnings on Lake Superior. Now, what is a gale? A gale is a very strong wind that is not quite at hurricane wind speed, but can still do quite some damage. Lake Superior is known for these gales because it's such a large lake, and it's especially bad in November. Mariners even have a phrase for this, and that's the Witch of November. This phrase dates all the way back to Native Americans that had settled in the Upper Peninsula. Because Gitche Gumee is such a big lake, these gales can whip up some furious winds as they travel northwest to southeast, getting quite strong near Whitefish Bay at the very southeast end of Lake Superior. You see, just like a hurricane, gales can gain steam as they travel over water for long periods of time. This also creates huge waves in the lake, including what mariners call rogue waves. And a rogue wave is basically a wave that is twice the size of most normal waves on that body of water. And it will come out of nowhere and sneak up on sailors, causing shipwrecks. This all possibly lends to the nickname of Whitefish Bay, and that's the graveyard of the Great Lakes. Another part of that Gordon Lightfoot song is the line, "The lake, it is said, never gives up her dead." And that's partly because the bottom of Lake Superior usually hovers around 32 to 34 degrees, and the bodies and ships that are down there never come back up to surface. Not to get too graphic, but it's almost like a natural freezer down there, so some divers actually describe seeing the skin of bodies still intact at these shipwrecks. This is a post-mortem process called adipocere. And Whitefish Bay, being a bay of Lake Superior, has at least 200 shipwrecks at or near the vicinity of its area, hence the graveyard of the Great Lakes. Anyway, back to our main story. There was one other ship that had eyesight on the Edmund Fitzgerald, and that was the SS Arthur M. Anderson, which was about 15 miles behind the Fitz. The Anderson was going to a completely different place than the Queen of the Great Lakes, but both had to travel past Whitefish Bay through the Sioux Locks. And when the Fitz and the Anderson were informed of this gale warning, they both changed their path so that they'd travel more through the central part of Lake Superior. This was to try to avoid the worst parts of the storm, because they believed most of the winds would be coming from the northeast, actually. And at the end of November 9th, the Fitz and the Anderson were traveling through this storm the best that they could. A weather report from the Fitz at 1 a.m. showed the Fitz traveling 20 miles south of Michigan's only national park, Isle Royale. And this weather report would say that winds were at about 52 knots or 59.8 miles per hour, with waves at about 10 feet high. The next morning at 7 a.m. on November 10th, there was one more weather report from the Fitz. It showed the winds had actually subsided a bit, going down to about 35 knots or 40.2 miles per hour, with waves still at 10 feet. These were not huge waves for captains like Ernest McSorley, who at this point had definitely been through worse storms, but the weather was about to take a turn for the worse. The next weather report for the Fitz would usually be released at 1 p.m. after the 7 a.m. weather report, but the Fitz never released another weather report that day, and it was very unusual for a seasoned captain like Ernest McSorley to just forget his weather report. So between the times of 7 a.m. and 1 p.m., the weather must have gotten a lot worse, which indeed it did because the Arthur M. Anderson reported this too. A couple educated guesses that some experts give is that there was a spare propeller blade on board that could have been tossed around in the waves and could have damaged the ship. It's also quite possible that a hatch cover got damaged in the weather, and this would have allowed water to get into the cargo hold. Captain Jesse Cooper of the Arthur M. Anderson remembered that the Fitz had gotten dangerously close to 6 Fathom Shoal near Caribou Island in Canada. Which leads to one more theory about the sinking of the Fitz, and that's that the ship had hit this shoal near Caribou Island, and that impact caused so much damage that it started leaking water and started getting into the cargo holds of the ship where all those taconite pellets were. Sadly, right before Caribou Island, there was another island that the Fitz could have stopped at, and that's Michipicoten Island. This was the last place that the Queen of the Lakes could have stopped and boarded at if the ship was damaged, but it's possible that McSorley thought he could get much further in this storm. Which is backed up by the fact that we got our first radio transmission from the Fitz from Ernest McSorley to Captain Jesse Cooper saying, quote, "I've sustained some topside damage, I've a fence rail laid down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list. I'm checking down. Will you stay by me till I get to Whitefish?" Now, if you don't know what a list is, that means that the captain has confirmed that the ship is taking on water and is leaning to one side. Now, as you know, the SS Arthur M. Anderson was about 15 miles away, and this could have been happening for a while, but they could not see the ship with enough detail to note this. McSorley definitely knew he was in trouble, though, and he decided to slow down so that the Arthur M. Anderson could catch up and be about 10 miles behind them instead of 15. Cooper then asked McSorley if he had the pumps going, and this was pumps in the ballast tank to get water off the ship. As McSorley also mentioned, he had 2 vents lost or damaged, and these vents are used to maintain air pressure in the hold of the ship. If those vents are damaged, that means there was basically a hole in the deck where water could get in. 40 minutes later at 4:10 p.m., McSorley radios the Anderson again, saying, quote, "I have lost both radars. Can you provide me with radar plots till we reach Whitefish Bay?" unquote. In which Captain Cooper replied, quote, "Charlie on that, Fitzgerald. We'll keep you advised of position," unquote. 29 minutes later at 4:39 p.m., it is reported that the Fitz isn't picking up the radio beacon from Whitefish Point, and so McSorley radios the emergency channel of the Coast Guard at Grand Marais, Michigan. He was calling for information on the beacon and the light at Whitefish Point. But a nearby saltwater vessel called the Avafors reported back saying that the beacon and the light were not operating at Whitefish Point. Now, since radars have become a thing on ships, it's important to note that lights at lighthouses have pretty much become unnecessary. If you have a radar, then you know where the shore is. There's no need for a gigantic light to guide mariners to shore. But sadly, since the Fitz's radar had stopped working, they had no way to radar themselves to Whitefish Point. They were pretty much sailing blind. Approximately 1 hour later, the Avafors finally got back to the Fitz, saying that they had turned on the light at Whitefish Point, but the radio beacon was still not on. And here was the first sign of true distress from our captain McSorley. It was heard off mic that he said to a crew member, "Don't let nobody on deck." The Avafors then asked, "What's that, Fitzgerald?" "Unclear. Over." In which McSorley responded, "I have a bad list. Lost both radars and am taking heavy seas over the deck. One of the worst seas I've ever been in." And as I said earlier, McSorley had been working on ships for over 40 years. So if this is one of the worst seas he's ever been in, that's saying a lot. Now, the SS Arthur M. Anderson had already reported winds of about 43 knots or 49 miles per hour. But around 7 p.m., the crew of the Anderson was hit by 35-foot waves, or 10-meter waves. Now, this isn't exactly ocean-sized waves, but for ships that only travel the Great Lakes, these are pretty big waves that can still cause some damage. The thing is, though, the Anderson and the Fitz were weathered ships, meaning they were prepared for storms like this, yet the Anderson was faring much better than the Fitz at this point. At about 7:10 p.m., the Anderson was about 10 miles behind the Queen of the Lakes, and they knew that they were in some trouble. Cooper radioed McSorley again and said, quote, "Fitzgerald, we're about 10 miles behind you and gaining about 1.5 miles per hour. Fitzgerald, there's a target 19 miles ahead of us, so the target would be 9 miles on ahead of you," unquote. The Anderson was going to attempt to pass to the west of the Fitz so that they could see the ship a little bit better and they could call the Coast Guard if anything were to happen. Cooper then asked, quote, "By the way, Fitzgerald, how are you making out with your problem?" unquote. McSorley replied, quote, "We are holding our own," unquote. And and this would be the last words that anyone would hear from Ernest McSorley or the 29 men on the Edmund Fitzgerald. Even though the Anderson was gaining on the Fitz, something called a squall stopped the Anderson from seeing the Fitz at 7:15 p.m. The Fitz was only 17 miles from Whitefish Bay. Now, a squall is, quote, a strong wind characterized by sudden onset in which the wind speed increases at least 16 knots and is sustained at 22 knots or more for at least 1 minute, unquote. So the wind was rapping furiously on the sea to the point where no one could see in front of them. And weather pattern simulations from that day show that winds were coming from the northwest instead of the northeast, as they were the day before. And this created a swirl of winds and ferocious waves that traveled even further across the Great Lakes and whipped up even bigger waves. And when the squall dissipated at 7:20 p.m., the Fitzgerald was not only out of sight of the Anderson, but also completely off the Anderson's radar. For a ship to sink within 5 minutes is extremely unusual. But considering the Fitz had thousands of tons of iron ore on the ship, it's quite possible that once the Fitz got underwater, she quickly torpedoed to the bottom. After Captain Cooper had realized the Queen of the Lakes was off his radar, he called the Coast Guard to say that he realized that the Fitz may be gone. It took about an hour and 40 minutes for the Coast Guard to get back to them, in which they informed them that they had no available rescue ships for a search. They even asked Captain Cooper if he could go back out and search for the Fitz. Even though there was still a raging storm going on, the Anderson still went back out and looked for the Fitzgerald and the 29 people that may have been lost. She was joined by 2 other freighters, but to no avail. They could only find lifeboats, debris, rafts, but no crew around. A Coast Guard helicopter would survey the scene around 10:53 p.m., but they too could not find any survivors. And that is when they came to the conclusion that the SS Edmund Fitzgerald and the 29 people aboard had perished at sea. The next morning, the Mariners Church of Detroit had rang its church bell once for each person lost on the Fitz, a total of 29 times. And the church would do this every year until 2006, when they decided to change their ways and ring a bell for every person lost on the Great Lakes. The news was all over the papers. The families had experienced a tragedy that would forever change their lives, and shipping on the Great Lakes would change forever too. This was the largest shipwreck that the Great Lakes had ever seen. 14 days after the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, on November 24th, 1975, a man named Gordon Lightfoot would pick up a Newsweek magazine and read an article called The Cruelest Month. Over the next month, he would write lyrics and musical arrangements about what he read in this article and other newspaper clippings that he had found. And in December of 1975, he would record what would be one of the most famous folk songs of all time, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. It would be released the following year, and it would hit number 1 on the Canadian billboards and number 2 on the US Hot 100, respectively. In the next year after the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the Navy would spend 8 days investigating the Edmund Fitzgerald with an unmanned submersible. And what it found was the bow and stern section of the ship were about 170 feet apart in this area. The depth of the lake in the area that it sunk at was about 530 feet, and the bow section of the ship was buried in 30 feet of mud and sticking out. It was also standing upright, meaning the bow torpedoed into the mud and hit bedrock until it could go no further. There was a middle 2 feet of the ship that was completely lost and torn apart, and the taconite pellets that they were hauling was scattered between the bow and stern section. This probably means that the Fitz could not have broken apart while it was above water. Probably means that it hit bedrock and broke apart, or it broke apart while descending, because otherwise the taconite would not be so neatly scattered between the bow and stern section of the ship. Further investigation of the ship found that it had no damage to the outer edges of the Fitz, meaning that it's unlikely that it hit 6 Fathom Shoal near Caribou Island. Searchers also found no damage to 6 Fathom Shoal, and if a 729-foot ship like the Fitz hit that shoal, it likely would have caused some damage. Now, divers did 4 more expeditions to look more closely at the Fitz, one in 1980, one in 1989, one in 1994, and one in 1995. On these expeditions, divers found that some of these hatch clamps were still intact, and if these hatch clamps were locked, it's likely they would have been damaged or twisted when the ship hit the bottom of the lake and the taconite started pouring out of the hatches. But the fact that they are still intact means it's possible that they were not tightened. This is just one diver's theory, and it's not 100% certain. But it's possible that that spare propeller blade, several violent waves, or flying debris could have damaged the hatch covers. Those hatch covers were covering the cargo hold, meaning lots of water could have gotten in. And if one of those hatch covers were damaged and letting in more water than the ship could pump out, then that's another possible theory for the sinking of the ship. I also mentioned that the SS Anderson experienced some rogue waves, and that those rogue waves were most likely headed for the Queen of the Lakes. Now, if the Fitz did experience some rogue waves, it might not be the sole reason that it sunk, but it could be possible that it got it underwater and all the weight of the taconite pellets on board then torpedoed it to the bottom. Regardless, we know from the calls from McSorley that the ship had experienced some damage and did have a list. And the fact that there was no weather report at 1 p.m. means something could have happened early that day, but we'll just never know. And maybe McSorley thought that they could get to Whitefish Bay, but he misjudged just how bad the waves and the weather really were. He was a seasoned captain, but maybe this was a storm of the century. Now, after that final expedition in 1995, the family said that we've had enough. We want to let our loved ones finally rest. But they did agree to let the divers take the bell from the ship and finally raise it. And you can visit this bell at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum in Whitefish Point. It has a really cool exhibit on Great Lakes shipwrecks in general. If you want to read more into the Edmund Fitzgerald and other Great Lakes shipwrecks, I'd highly suggest going there. As for the shipwreck itself, please do not go there without a license to dive. For one, you will get arrested, as in 2005 and 2006, Ontario made it illegal for people to dive or use sonars on protected sites, and the Edmund Fitzgerald shipwreck is a protected site. But otherwise, I do think it's important to remember the lives of those that are lost. These were real people that experienced a real death, and some of their family members are still around and mourn to this day. And also, I just want to say that you should respect nature. At times, it can be the most beautiful thing in the world, and can be a reminder of what makes life worth living, but could also cost you your life at any point. Thank you for watching Tales of the Great Lakes. Next time we'll have a slightly lighter subject, and that's the creation of Thousand Island dressing. Did you know that there's an area in Canada called the Thousand Islands, and that a woman from these islands created what we now know today as Thousand Island dressing? Subscribe to our channel and check back next time to learn more about it.